welcome everybody here in the room and welcome everybody connected from home. Welcome to a before Christmas seminar, a December seminar. And this time, before Christmas. No, the room is fantastic. You cannot see it from home, but the roof, the ceiling actually of this room, it's all decorated with frescoes. So it's very, very nice. And this time, this is a seminar, is not a seminar like many other seminars that Abstraction, the project and research group Abstraction organized in the past months. This time, the seminar sees a larger audience from remote, also because it's jointly organized, let's say, with the Metaphor Lab Amsterdam, with the Metaphor Lab. And so we have colleagues, friends, and members of the Metaphor Lab as well from remote. We have colleagues from the CIRM, the National Research Institution working on metaphor. I see Anna Francesca connected and others. And so it's really a joint seminar, a joint event that sees a colleague of mine, of us, that I'm very happy to introduce and to host here in Bologna, Cristina Despot, Cristina Stracalde. And she is one of the leading figures in contemporary Croatian linguistics and a very international scholar whose work bridges cognitive theory, historical philology, and language technology. So the past, the present, and the future of metaphor studies and cognitive linguistics. She earned her PhD in Zagreb, and she has been affiliated with the Institute of the Croatian Language since 2003. But her career is not simply a national career. And many of you will know her because of her collaboration, her influential collaboration with the Berkeley group. She has been working with Lakoff himself in Berkeley. And let's say, when she was visiting there as a Fulbright, right? As a Fulbright fellow with a Fulbright scholarship, very prestigious scholarship. And then she constructed and coordinated the repository of Croatian language metaphors. And since then, let's say, her international visibility has only increased. I've had the pleasure to collaborate and exchange scientific ideas with Cristina at the Metaphor Lab in Amsterdam, as well as meeting with her again on many occasions like Oxford and here in Bologna as well. Intellectually, her scholarship unfolds on three, as I said, intersecting research directions: cognitive linguistics, national philology, and also lexicography and the construction of language resources. She is the author of 5 books, not only scientific books, but also novels, and editor of many more. And she authored dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed scientific papers. So without any further ado, I would like to thank again everybody to be here and to be connected from remote. I don't know if Gudrun, would you like to add something besides of the Metaphor Lab? Please do so.
Hello. I don't have much to add. It's just that I'm really happy that we can actually join this meeting. And maybe in the chat, I will post my email address because we are also hosting around 6 online meetings per year where we invite people, or where people join to present their research, ongoing projects, new projects, prepare for conference presentations, all quite low-key. And everyone who's interested in joining the mailing list can then send me a message and feel free to join so that you know when we meet, and so that you can also join those sessions if you want.
Fantastic. Perfect. Thank you very much. And so I think now we can really start today's seminar, and I let the floor to Christina. Thank you again for being here.
Sono molto felice di essere qui con voi oggi. Ringrazio Mariana per avermi invitata e per avermi dato l'occasione di tornare di nuovo in Italia, che adoro. Thank you, Mariana, so much. Mariana is much, much more than my colleague. She's already now a very, very close friend. We met in Amsterdam. She was a Marie Curie fellow at that time, and our friendship just enriches and becomes stronger after that. And we also co-published a book together. And now we collaborate, and we have many more plans for further collaboration. So thank you, Mariana, again. And thank all of you. I was really happy to have met all of you before when I was here. So I'm really glad to be here again. So the topic that we will discuss today is metaphor literalization strategy, from concrete to abstract and back to concrete again. This work has been, a small part of it has been published within another publication, but basically it's a concept that I'm still working on. It's a work in progress, so I think it's great to discuss it with you today and with all of you online, especially with metaphor-led people, to maybe refine it and to have your feedback. That would be really nice. And I picked this topic exactly because I think it's relevant for abstraction project, because we will talk about how metaphor usually, of course, goes from concrete to abstract, but we will discuss these cases when it goes back to concrete again. So a kind of full circle. This project has been we are dealing with it within my project that I am conducting in Croatia within the Next Generation EU Metacrow project. So of course, first I will give a really brief overview of the theories behind what I'm going to talk about today. You're probably all very, very familiar with this, but it's not a bad thing to maybe just briefly go through it, because it's going to be relevant for what I plan to talk about today. So, of course, following the cognitive and neural revolutions, of course, it has become evident that metaphor shapes our perception of reality and constitutes the foundation of our ability to reason, to communicate ideas, especially abstract ones, of course, and to understand the world. Of course, this is a really, really basic thing. We all are very well aware of this. And of course, metaphor also acts as a kind of bridge between concrete and the abstract. We know this already from the conceptual theory and many other theories before the conceptual metaphor theory. And then, of course, it also guides our thinking and influences our understanding of the truth. The truth is going to be a very important thing that we're going to discuss today, the relationship between metaphor and truth. So basically, within conceptual metaphor theory, we have this very operational definition of metaphor as thinking or speaking about one semantic frame, which is usually more abstract, as if it were another semantic frame, usually a more concrete one. And then this involves some kind of metaphorical mappings, usually unidirectional in linguistic metaphor, between these two frames, between the source frame and the target frame. Of course, this is a very, very basic but a correct definition of metaphor that we will work with today. And the other thing that I would like to talk about today about metaphor is about its falseness, because metaphor is actually false. It's, of course, non-literal, but in its very nature, in its core, it's just false. because we know that the schema of metaphorical mappings is A is B, and sometimes this is how it is reflected in language as well. But we know that this is not actually the true. A is not identical to B. So when we say Juliet is the sun, of course, we are all aware that it's not actually true, but that Juliet is in some ways like sun. But still, we talk about her as if she really was a sun. So this is what I mean when I say that metaphor is false and disruptive in its nature. So all definitions of metaphor, even from the literary theory, include this disruptive nature of metaphor with respect to the truth. So metaphor involves some kind of conscious violation of established categories. So in its core, it's basically untrue. But for example, in pragmatic approaches like Grice's and Searle's, metaphor is not treated as falsehood, but rather as implicitly expressed truth, which is also correct because you can lie with metaphor and with literal language, and you can say truth with both with metaphor and with literal language. So it's a bit complex topic, I think, because we all agree that metaphor is not true, but then it can be implicitly true. So this is a philosophically interesting question. I think maybe not linguistically that much, but for what we are going to talk about today, it is also interesting, I think. So this seemingly paradoxical nature of the truthfulness of metaphor is well captured by Barfield's a quote that metaphor reveals by concealing. I think this is a really, really nice way to say what metaphor basically does. So within pragmatic views, we distinguish between the truthfulness of metaphor and literalness of metaphor. And I think this is a useful distinction, because a literal statement is nothing more than a statement expressed in literal language, and literal truth is not a type of truth, but rather truth expressed in literal language. Okay, this sounds a bit complex, but I think I explained it before, so you know what I mean, I hope. So Binkley, for example, does not deny that metaphors are false in their literal meaning, but he argues that this is irrelevant because the speaker never intended to express that literal meaning that is false, but the speaker wants to express this figurative meaning that is basically true. So this is, again, this interesting relationship between truthfulness and metaphor. And for example, Davidson maintains that metaphorical sentences are always false, but the non-propositional insight inspired by a metaphor is true. So basically, everybody is saying the same thing, I would say. Yes, it is false, logically false, but then pragmatically it is true because you're basically not lying. Or if you don't want to lie, you're not lying. But if you want, you can lie both with literal language and with figurative language as well. And what about this truthfulness of metaphor within conceptual metaphor theory and within cognitivism? This is an interesting question because we know that cognitivism was born as a kind of reaction to objectivism. You know all about this from Lakoff's book, the first one, and all of those who followed it. Objectivism in terms of Cartesian dualism and Kantian views of reason, of course, as being disembodied, formalized, etc., etc. And then we have subjectivism as a really harsh opposition to objectivism, which argues that truth depends entirely on one's own perspective and that absolute truth does not exist at all. And of course, we know that entire postmodernism was built on this subjectivistic idea. But then we have cognitivism, and it's a kind of a third path between objectivism and subjectivism, because Lakoff and Johnson already in their 1999 book view the use of metaphor as neither objective nor subjective rationality, but rather as imaginative rationality. I'm a cognitivist as well, and I really like this notion of imaginative rationality, and I like the fact that it is a kind of third path that reconciles these two distinct and harsh oppositions between objectivism and subjectivism. So conceptual metaphor theory does not deny the existence of truth, but maintains that metaphor as imaginative rationality compensates for our inability to know what truth is with complete certainty. So basically, what Lakoff and Johnson state is that our truth is shaped by our conceptual system and the metaphors we use. So without our fact that everything we think about is filtered through our conceptual systems, and then, of course, metaphors, as we know how important metaphors are for the thinking process, then this truth is somehow like filtered through this filter of conceptualization. So it's neither completely true or neither false, but it is just the fact that it is shaped by the fact that we as humans have the bodies we have, that we are embodied, that we use figurativeness in our thinking process. So I like this view of truthfulness within conceptual metaphor theory. And then to go back to the definition of metaphor as being a mapping of source domain to a target domain semantic frame, expressed by this formula A is B, which of course suggests that A is identical to B, but we have already discussed why this is not the case, and we will discuss it a little bit more. But however, of course, we all know this is also basic conceptual metaphor theory stuff, that the nature of metaphorical mapping is partial. That is why A is not identical to B, because we don't map everything from one source frame to a target frame, but we map only certain aspects, not the whole knowledge we have. Otherwise, the metaphor wouldn't make sense, because it would just be two identical concepts. So, and then from this partial nature of metaphorical mappings, we have two important notions connected to metaphor theory, and that is metaphorical highlighting and hiding, because metaphor necessarily highlights certain aspects of the target frame and hide other aspects. Of course, classical example for this is argument, verbal conflict concept or semantic frame, where we in most of the languages we know use a war frame to frame or to conceptualize a verbal argument, and this makes us much more passionate, much more aggressive when we fight. So the fact that we all many languages use this war semantic frame to conceptualize argument makes us think about argument or highlight the aggressive aspect of this concept, and somehow hide the collaborative aspect, because the fact is that when we argue, we also give a precious time to somebody. Also, if you argue, you care enough to argue. So, but somehow the fact that we use the war frame just makes us completely forget the good side of the verbal conflict that we have, and we completely highlight the aggressive one. So this is what metaphors do. And so today I will talk about metaphor literalization strategy, where everything is in opposition to what I was talking about so far. So we have the fact that vast majority of metaphor theory is focused on these partial metaphorical mappings, which usually is the case with metaphor. And that is these selective projections from a source domain onto a target domain. But there are discursive situations in which this principle of partiality is strategically suspended. And this was very interesting to me to see. So speakers can, under specific pragmatic conditions, simulate the literal truthness of metaphor and thereby force a temporary ontological reclassification of the target. I know this is abstract right now, but there will be example very shortly to make this much more easily understandable. And we term this mechanism the metaphor literalization strategy. Of course, it has a lot of theoretical context. I will just mention some of the theories that are relevant for this notion. But important theoretical context for this notion of metaphor literalization strategy is, of course, that after conceptual metaphor theory, there were some subsequent developments in the view of our cognition, especially for e-cognition, so-called embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended cognition. This is all very relevant for the strategy I will talk about. Of course, these approaches see metaphor not only as a cognitive mapping, but also as a situated, dynamic, action-oriented phenomenon, and we all very well know that it is. And these new approaches mostly look at metaphor in real communication, and the examples I will show later are also from real communication. So these new theories are more relevant for a good description of the phenomenon than maybe cognitive approach or conceptual metaphor theories. Then some other approaches like ecological approaches, dynamic approach to metaphor, dialogical metaphor enactment approach, etc., they are all relevant because they take into account the intertwining of social, cognitive, affective processes in the production and understanding of metaphors. And another theory that is going to be very relevant is a theory of metaphor enactment. The fact that metaphors can be also enacted in a real communication. So the term enacted does not denote a different kind of metaphor, but a different kind of engagement with metaphor. And this is important because later we might ask like how this strategy that I'm talking about, metaphor literalization strategy, is different from metaphor enactment, but I will show that it is. I mean, both are valuable, but we need some distinction, at least I think so. Also, the notion of metaphoricity as being a scalar concept, so that a certain mapping or a view that we see world is not only either metaphorical or not, it is metaphorical to a certain degree. And I like this notion because I will show examples where it is totally lowered. So we can say that source domain and target domain can be divided very strictly, or these distinctions may be blurred. But in my cases with metaphor literalization strategy, they are not only blurred, but they are completely erased, like pretended. But yeah, I will show the example and it's going to be probably easier. Also, the degree of embodiment that Jeanette Littlemore was talking about is also relevant. So it is not like binary conditions, but everything is scalar, both metaphoricity and embodiment. This metaphor literalization strategy, as I said, is the case where this division between source and target is not only blurred, but completely erased. And basically we pretend as if we believe that source is really, that target is really source. So the level of metaphoricity is lowered to the level of literalness, and metaphorical mappings become complete. So this is very interesting, I think, about this phenomenon, that we don't operate with partial metaphorical mappings anymore, but now we have pretended complete mappings between the two. And this makes the metaphor re-literalized or re-concretized in a sense. In a paper that I've written with my colleague Anna, who is here, hi Anna, and Tony Veal, we have analyzed the implicitly insulting language, and we have devised, based on the data set that we collected within one cost action called Nexus Linguarum, we have devised a new typology of implicitly offensive language, and of course metaphor played a significant role in implicitly offensive language, as you all might guess. And here we have, I will not go into details of this typology, it's not that relevant for this talk today, but here is where we discovered this strategy. We looked at certain examples and we were like, okay, what's going on there? There is something strange going on in these examples. This is the paper, so if you're interested, I mean, there are really, really good examples here of human creativity when they want to insult somebody. That's really amazing. But I will only show certain examples where we have this metaphor literalization strategy going on. Okay, so here is the very good example of what I was talking about. Better yet, that she-dog. Here, girl, good girl, here, I will give you a biscuit. Okay, so here is a person talking to a female target of the insult, and obviously we have dehumanization going on here and this dehumanization is obviously achieved through metaphor, where we conceptualize the target of the insult as a non-human, in this case, a dog. And of course, the underlying conceptual metaphor is very simple. It's a woman is a dog, or a female person is a bitch, or a female dog, to be a bit rude. And of course, as all animalistic metaphors, this metaphor as well suggests a lack of sophistication, self-control, intelligence, rationality, etc. Although I adore dogs, so for me to say I was a dog would be a good thing, but conceptual system doesn't work that way. So we still like map these bad things about whenever we talk about human as animal. Usually, most often it's the case that we talk about the lack of sophistication and intelligence, etc., etc. So obviously, this is the form of dehumanization in which the female target of the insult is conceptualized not only as a dog or a bitch in this case, but an obedient dog that can be lured with a biscuit. So a kind of really, really humiliating construct. And this expression, she-dog, may appear to function as euphemism that like avoids the more overt sexism of the word bitch, but actually, to me at least, it even activates it. It's by using this unusual, like she-dog construction, which somehow functions as euphemism, actually this sexism is even more pronounced. So by placing the target in the subordinate position of a dog eager for treats, the speaker projects himself into a position of power and dominance. This is, of course, not so closely related to the notion of metaphor literalization strategy. This is what we could probably devise just from the conceptual metaphor and from looking at pragmatic and conceptual nature of this expression. But what's striking about this example and what makes it metaphor literalization strategy is the fact that the interlocutor basically pretends to believe that the metaphor is in fact true and that the target of his insult is really a dog, and then he addresses her accordingly, which introduces a performative dimension that completely absolutizes what we would otherwise call partial metaphorical mapping. So this is really complex because the interlocutor pretends to believe the metaphor and then he enacts this belief. So he basically completely behaves as if the other person really is a dog, and he talks to other person in that way, like, good girl, come here, I'll give you a biscuit. So the way you would talk to the dog, now you talk to another human being. And this is basically the metaphor literalization strategy. So this strategy can also be understood as a performative intensification of metaphor in the sense of the speech act theory, where the enacted metaphor does not merely describe, but actively constitutes this social reality. So we have a conceptual metaphor and linguistic metaphors as kind of locution. Then on the elocution side, we have insult and the attempt of controlling another human being. And as perlocution, we have this humiliation that the target of our insult must feel when treated and when talked to in this way. So the underlying metaphor, a woman is a dog, we see how somehow inadequate is to how inadequate it is to describe this interesting example. So this metaphor is not merely stated, but it is performed as literal truth. So the speaker addresses the target through the behavioral script of dog training. We have command, obedience, and then reward. And this produces an extreme form of dehumanization. So what this does, it makes insult much, much worse. The fact that interlocutor pretends to believe the metaphor was true and that he behaves in that way makes this insult much, much harsher, I would say. So the schematic model of this strategy could be formalized. I'm still thinking about this, but this is an attempt of formalization. So first we have activation of conventional metaphor where person is a dog. Then we have a strategic suspension of this figurative awareness and the metaphor is treated as being literal. Then we have ontological role assignment. So now we have a complete mapping. So a person is not a person anymore, but now she really is a female dog or a bitch. In other examples of this strategy, it can be object or child or parasite or stuff like that, where we actually also enact, but also believe that the metaphor is true. And then after this ontological role assignment, we have script enactment. So basically we are in a role where we believe the metaphor is true and we have this performance and enactment of this belief, of this true metaphor, let's say. And then in this special case that I presented, we also have this power realignment and symbolic degradation. It is not the case with all literalizations of metaphors, but in this case it was, but it always is some kind of change that we have, like some kind of catharsis when we have the need to use something as strong as metaphor literalization strategy. It always has some strong effect in the end. In this case, it is the effect of power realignment and this symbolic degradation. So for the metaphor literalization strategy, we have a metaphor, of course, then we have this pragmatic pretense, then we have O or ontological reassignment, then we have script enactment where we pretend to play, and in the end we have some kind of power redistribution or other kind of catharsis in the end of the usage of this metaphor. Some other examples of this strategy are a bit milder one. They are not as bad as the ones I mentioned first. And these are the examples where we infantilize the interlocutor. So we want to say that the interlocutor is just not mature enough. And also we talk to him and treat him as if he really or she really was a child. And typical cases, very conventional cases that we don't even think about, are like attaboy, good boy, or this a bit more interesting non-conventional way in the example 4. Did the money your grandparents sent you in a singing card buy the souped up factarded laptop you are rocking? So also very creative way to insult somebody, but also pretending like as if this person was still a child that receives a singing card from their grandparents. So basically or a very conventional expression like grow up, where we pretend to believe that there is not a grown-up person talking with us. So these examples are maybe not as harsh as the one I talked about first, but they are performative basically in the same way. They literally treat the interlocutor as a child through this strategy of metaphor literalization, and therefore significantly usually intensifying the insult. However, these are not the cases of dehumanization, but rather derogation within the typology that Anna, Tony, and I devised. So it is milder in a sense also. It's not that harsh. Some other interesting cases of the usage of metaphor literalization strategy come from psychotherapy, for example. We know that metaphor constitutes a very powerful instrument in psychotherapy. And there are many new insights about how metaphor should and should not be used in psychotherapy. And there are many different approaches. Of course, you imagine that in the beginning, the approach was to reframe the patient's metaphor, that the metaphor the patients use, and sometimes it is valuable, but new approaches opposed to this, saying that it is much better to work with the metaphor the patient actually uses, because this constitutes some kind of a shared space between a patient and the therapist, because sometimes patient can badly react to the a bit forced change of the frame. So there are many approaches that use this, like using the metaphor that patient uses. And this approach by Ruchinska and Fondelli, for example, is particularly interesting for what I'm talking about, because in the beginning of the usage of metaphor in psychotherapy, what the therapist did was to try to enact or to play through the metaphor. So kind of really, really embodiment in a literal sense of the metaphor. But Ruchinska and Fondelli, for example, also shown that we can do this with dialogue as well, that we don't need a play or a pretense play or a real embodiment or a real enactment, but that also dialogue can be effective if we concentrate on the metaphor that patient uses and work with it in a sense that we propose some kind of action with this metaphor, because metaphors in a way that conceptual metaphor theory defined it is kind of nominal. It's always A is B, like a nominal construction. But here we can see that new approaches focus on the verbs connected to metaphor, and then this is where the change should happen. This is an example of this approach that is called systematic collaborative approach, but I won't go into details of this now because I have a more interesting example later of MLs in psychotherapy, but this is a kind of like ways to adopt the figurative language theories into psychotherapy and show that it really can be effective. I don't know how it's the case in Italy, but for example, in Croatia, usually psychology students don't even have a single like course in linguistics, and it would be really, I think, useful and important because the language is their main tool in psychotherapy, and it's really important what metaphors you use, how you use them. So it would, I think, really be, but that's not the topic of this talk, but it would be really useful if psychotherapists would be aware of what language basically can do, and it can do a lot. We are well aware of that. This is another approach that is really, really interesting for what I'm talking about today. And this is the confidentiality-based approach by Timothy Thomas. I will read his entire quote because I think it's really, really interesting because it says exactly what I'm talking about today. So this is what he says about his approach. My therapeutic approach is based on the literal interpretation of metaphor. And I have named this therapeutic approach confidentiality as it fully embraces the client's metaphor as a shared one and treats it with an openly positive attitude. And this enables us to connect on a deep level of communication and understanding. The more we explore the shared metaphor, the more we enrich and deepen our communication, thereby laying the foundations for achieving the desired change in life. For example, in a situation where a client has a very short deadline for submitting an important report and is, as a result, under pressure from colleagues and experiencing high levels of stress, it may be intuitive and tempting for the therapist to teach him time management skills, work responsibility, etc., and to listen to the client criticize himself while feeling guilt. However, the actual level where this attitude changes occurs when we discuss metaphors with confidentiality. And it is precisely this that motivates me to be literal with metaphors. This is what a psychotherapist said. This is really interesting. So he wants to be literal with metaphors. What this actually means, I will show right now. So this is what Thomas would do. When a client tells him, I feel haunted by deadlines, they intimidate me, the therapist will not focus on the concept of deadlines, which would be a very usual way to approach the problem, but rather the therapist will focus on the metaphorical word haunted here. And he would ask questions such as, what exactly is haunting you? In the case study described here in this paper, the client responds on the follow-up questions like that it's a kind of ghost hovering above the client's head. And then again, the therapist will work with this metaphor. He will not try to change it, but then ask, more concrete questions about this ghost, like where exactly above your head is this ghost, or something like that. And then the client points to her right shoulder and elaborates how this is where she feels pressure. So notice that now it is already literalized. So they are talking about this ghost, like where exactly it is. So the client shows it's here, right here. It presses on my shoulder, etc., etc. So the confidentiality that Thomas is talking about here means that the therapist believes that the metaphor of the ghost hovering above client's head is actually true. So the role of the therapist is not to change the metaphor or to challenge it or to discredit it or to attempt to reframe it, which we really like as metaphor theoreticians, but to treat this metaphor as true, to respect it, to work with it, and to create the groundwork for a clearer perception. And this also creates a better connection between the therapist and the client. So this strategy is also the strategy of complete rather than a partial mappings between the source and the target. And then what therapist does next is that he suggests, okay, now take this ghost that is hovering on your left shoulder, move it in front of you and describe me and tell me what you see. So you see that we basically re-concretize the entire metaphor of the ghost. We believe that there is really something here on her shoulder, and we want the client to bring it in front of her and to describe it to us. And of course, you can all guess what happens then. And it happened in this case study as well, that the client says, oh my God, now that I see it in front of me, it's not that intimidating at all. It's much smaller than I thought it was, etc., etc. So, and this is this catharsis I was mentioning. So the client basically, his perception is changed by the manipulation of metaphorical objects. So she's both enacting and literalizing the metaphor. And yeah, I think this is, so in this context, this metaphor literalization strategy does not degrade the subject, but enhances the agency and enables the whole narrative reconfiguration. So based on this manipulation, based on the belief of the therapist that the metaphor was true, the entire reconfiguration happens between a client and his fears or her fears. Another cases of this use of the metaphor literalization strategy involved, of course, political and ideological dimensions, where we easily move from metaphor literalization strategy to real violence. Now, these are really, really serious cases where, of course, political metaphor demonstrates that metaphors in public discourse do not merely describe reality, but they morally evaluate it and mobilize collective emotions. And here, metaphor literalization strategy represent a particularly dangerous intensification of this mechanism. For example, in fascist and genocide discourse, metaphors such as the enemy is a parasite, or the nation is a body, or metaphors of social cleansing or real cleansing are frequently treated as literally true. So people tend to start to really believe these dangerous metaphors. And thereby, this converts metaphor into ontological justification for violence. And once people are treated not as if, but as they really are parasites or diseases or some other kind of like flood or anything that endangers us truly, then this justifies being violent with them. And this is where the conceptual metaphor and this metaphor literalization strategy becomes really, really powerful and really dangerous. So I would say that metaphor literalization strategy forms a kind of missing cognitive pragmatic link between metaphorical framing on one hand, scenario-based reasoning suggested by Mussel, for example, and ideological moralization. Because we can see that here in these cases, we have something more than metaphorical framing and scenario-based reasoning, etc. And this is this dangerous belief the fact that we truly start to believe metaphor. There are many cases like this, but this is a really, really dangerous one. And now to some nicer examples of metaphor literalization strategy. Of course, it can also be used in humor, in play, in advertising. And Mariana knows a lot about this because in her Vismet or visual metaphors repository, there are many, many cases of this. And this is really, really often used in advertising, where you will make the metaphor very literal, and then it's somehow captivating and memorable. The classic effect here is that the audience is somehow aware that the mapping is metaphorical, but still the performers act as if they believe the metaphor. This is also in theater and in humor very well used. Like, for example, you can charge somebody for real, like for wasting your time or for killing a good spirit or something like that. So you play with this literalness of metaphor. And here, humor emerges from ontological overcommitment to what is normally only a partial mapping. So here also there is this pretense that we truly believe either the performers or the audience. There are many cases of this. So there is this shared meta-awareness of the play in these cases. It lacks this coercive power asymmetry, as was the case with violence and insult, but it produces this kind of affective gain, amusement, or memorability, and of course, that's much nicer. So advertising discourse makes, of course, very systematic use of visual and multimodal metaphor literalization strategy, often by rendering these metaphors in real images and action. Like you can see a person literally being swept off their feet by a product, or stress depicted as a real physical burden that's imposing on the body, or freshness shown as a visible force really exploding. Mariana had examples like this in Vismet. Etc., etc. And here MLS functions as a mnemonic intensifier by collapsing metaphor into this apparent physical reality. There are some examples here, like Under the Weather, you can see, or Jam Session, where we jams playing. Or From the Bottom of Your Heart. This is really interesting. So, this is very, very often used in creativity to somehow literalize the metaphor, and then immediately you capture the attention of the speaker, because these are very conventional expressions, but when you literalize them, they become very memorable, like playing with the fire. I don't like this one because it's for kids, it might be dangerous to conceptualize playing with fire like this, but yeah, this is what I meant. So there are endless examples of this. Okay, so I will now, how much time do I have? Do you want me to end? So yeah, I will then, maybe we can do, yeah, okay, I will wrap it up now. I will just briefly say here I discussed why metaphor literalization strategy is different from extended metaphor, but I think that's obvious already. And it's also different from enacted metaphor. Usually it is enacted, but it doesn't have to be. So I think there is a valid need for both concepts. And also the relationship between MLS and deliberate metaphor theory is also very interesting, but we can maybe come back to this during the discussion. So there is a clear connection. Usually this metaphor is deliberate, but then there is something more to a metaphor literalization strategy. This is very brief explanation. Okay, this is very brief explanation of how metaphor literalization strategy differs from similar notions in metaphor theory. because in deliberate metaphor, attention is redirected to the source domain. In enacted metaphor, the metaphor is performed in action, but in metaphor literalization strategy, the metaphor is treated as ontologically true. So you can enact metaphor literalization, you usually are deliberate with it, but it doesn't have to be. So for something to be deliberate, metaphor doesn't need to be metaphor literalization strategy at the same time, and the same goes for enactment. So to go back to the example I started with, like good girl, here's your biscuit. This, of course, is deliberate and enacted and literalized. It's in this case, we have all three. But it is not just deliberate metaphor in the deliberate metaphor theory sense, because the goal is not to make the hearer only think about the metaphor, but the goal is to somehow force the hearer into the metaphor as a social role. So DMT explains metaphorical awareness, and MLS explains metaphorical domination and this completeness of mapping and belief in metaphor and etc., etc. So deliberate metaphors direct attention, and metaphor literalization strategy reorganizes ontology behind the metaphor. So to conclude, across all traditions and approaches to metaphor, different theories, one principle was really stable, and that was that metaphor presupposes non-identity between source and target. And it is precisely this presupposition that metaphor literalization strategy strategically suspends. And so this strategy pragmatically simulates the literal truth of the metaphor and enforces a temporary ontological reclassification of the target. And metaphors then are particularly powerful precisely when they are literalized. This is really interesting, or reconcretized. And that is when we pretend, and especially when we truly believe they were true. And there are cases like this as well. So this strategy has the kind of ethical duality within it, but I will not go into details of this because this is true for any metaphor and probably for any linguistic utterance. You can do a lot with metaphor. With the same linguistic mechanism, you can insult, you can humiliate, you can therapeutically transform, you can justify your violence, and you can participate in power plays, etc., etc. So this is, of course, everything is true about metaphor literalization strategy as well. So I think that this notion of literal metaphors or metaphor literalization strategy reveals a previously under-theorized interface between metaphor, truth, ontology, power, action, metaphorical mappings, etc. And by formalizing this shift from partial to simulated complete metaphorical mappings, we demonstrate how metaphors can become temporarily true within interaction. So this is important. This is not conceptual level. This is all interactional level. And how this temporary truth can either destroy or transform. So to conclude, metaphors are most powerful precisely when they are no longer treated as metaphors. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you for this rich presentation, this rich seminar full of ideas and thought-provoking comments. So I would like to now open the floor to comments, questions from the room here or from home. If there are any comments, Christina touched upon many theoretical backgrounds and everything, including in the last part, the deliberate metaphor theory, which was, I think, very interesting. And the last comment, the last statement, metaphors are most powerful precisely when they are no longer treated as metaphor. I'm still trying to process it and you know, and understand the consequences of this statement. So one thing. Oh, there is a question here. Sorry, behind the screen there was a hand waving. Paola, please, either you come here so they can hear from home, or you yell.
Christina, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I was wondering.
Can you hear from home? Otherwise, I can repeat then.
Maybe you come here.
Come here. I think
I was wondering whether multimodality maybe the best approach, multimodality maybe the best approach in order to study this kind of metaphors. Because reading your examples, I was thinking like phonetics, like participate in this literalization process, because like got a boy, good boy, and then there's a crescendo, like also like gesture. So for example, the dog example, the she dog. So I was like kind of imagining the situation where a person also like behaves in a certain way, like makes certain gestures. So I was wondering whether you can like you are going in that direction, like studying not just like on the very linguistic level, but since we are talking about like a very pragmatic perspective, because for me it seems that you are more focused on the role that metaphors may play in the actual word, like not just on a conceptual level, how we imagine the word, but how do we act with our word in the word, like it's speech theory. So I was wondering whether you were thinking about like looking for more levels.
You're absolutely right. And by showing the visual metaphors examples, that's what I wanted to show, that this doesn't need to be linguistic. And definitely the fact that we actually enter the role and we really talk exactly the same way we would talk to the dog. So if you would just say, good girl, come here. No, you need to say, good girl, come here, come here. So you really need to like enact and pretend as if the other person is still a dog. This definitely is a multimodal phenomenon, absolutely. And that's why it is interesting. And for the infantilization examples, for example, I don't know in Italian, but in Croatian, you don't even have to be like intelligible. You can just say, yeah, or something like that, where you really discredit the other person as being immature, like you are not even worthy of me talking to you as if you were a real grown-up person, but I will just, so it's, yeah, the language, of course, plays a major role, but also this conceptual level of using the conceptual metaphor. And as in other cases of the usage of conceptual metaphors, it doesn't have to be linguistic at all. I don't have right now examples where it's completely non-linguistic, except for these visual metaphors, but I can imagine like using gestures where you would not at all use language, but just by using gestures that you would use with somebody who is below you, let's say, or something like that. You can also insult and enact this strategy, I think. Very, very interesting. The multimodality is definitely very, very important here. Thank you for a good question.
And there is another question from Elena from remote. You are outdoor. Nice.
Yes, sorry. Thank you. Hi, I'm in the park. It's quieter. Thank you so much for this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, super. Thank you so much for this fascinating and insightful talk. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I have my notepad full of notes. I was just maybe it's a stupid question, but maybe I would ask you to I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit more on this strategic suspension of figurative awareness within literalization, metaphor literalization. I'm having a little bit of trouble of understanding this, because from the examples that you showed, my impression is that it is because both the interlocutor and locutor are within this idea that this is figurative, that they can furthermore elaborate and go into literalization. I mean, what I want to say is that even with a dog, you I don't think I don't think it's possible to actually believe that the person is a dog. Only within that figurative awareness you can elaborate and then say, well, come here, or I don't know if that was clear enough, but I think that's the point that I'm having troubles with the suspension of figurative awareness.
Yes, thank you very much. Very good question indeed. So what I was talking about is not that, I mean, you act as if you believe, not that you believe. There are cases where people truly believe the metaphor. There are many cases like the parasites and the other I mentioned, where people start to believe, even like with the argument and war and other war metaphors, when we are so much like immersed into a metaphor that we start actually believing. But the case with the dog is not that case. This is a pretense play. So the interlocutor pretends as if he believes. I mean, we are aware of the fact that he doesn't truly think that the other person was a dog, of course, but he pretends as if this was the truth. So this is why, like, the suspension of the awareness. It's not like deletion of the awareness, but just the suspension. So you pretend to believe the metaphor, as opposed to the cases where you actually believe. There are cases like this as well. So I hope this explains it a little bit.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more comments? Of course, these discourses are very much related to the idea of the notion of truth that you clarified, that you discussed in the first part of your talk. And since you are also an expert of language technology, I can't not say anything about.
Not an expert, just interested in far from expert.
in the conversations, when the interlocutor is a machine that may use metaphors, may not use metaphors, but yeah, this maybe opens a whole new parallel debate about the metaphors used by chatbots and ChatGPT and so forth, whether they have the same effect, perlocutory effect that metaphors have in human-human interaction, and if so, where's the responsibility, like, or what happens? So, but at least I think
this is really, really interesting question. And in the paper that we published, Anna and I, with Tonyville, this is what we dealt with, because we wanted to devise a typology of implicitly offensive language, because this is where even large language models have difficulties with implicitly, because when you have explicit offense, now they have these databases of offensive words, etc. So it's quite straightforward. It's not difficult anymore to automatically detect the cases of explicit offense, but the problems arise with implicit offense because, and we have shown in our paper that the phenomenon is so complex. This is just a small portion. This metaphor literalization strategy is just a small, tiny portion of the entire ability and our creativity, how to avoid being explicit, but then still being extremely cruel and not at all being milder because of using implicit language. So, and this strategy, as I said, is just a small, tiny portion of it, and it is this complex. I don't think I have delved in all the complexity of the phenomenon, but irony, metaphors, similes, etc., all the pragmatic details, it's really, really difficult.
I remember at a conference in Oxford in 2019, before ages ago, there was this person who was working on asylum seekers, with immigration centers, and with people who were raising the case in front of a committee in order to get, the permit to stay in a country. And this person, who was a linguist in France, he was in Calais, I think, he was saying that one of the guidelines that were given to these asylum seekers were to not use metaphors at all. Like when you describe your story, when you describe where you come from, your lifestyle before, what are you escaping from, and so forth, be as literal as possible.
But is it possible? I know about this like clean language movement.
Exactly.
From the cognitive point of view, I'm not convinced it's possible at all. I mean, you have to use, but maybe to avoid certain metaphor like parasites and flood and other
Try to
things
avoid-
which
yeah.
which may really trigger negative emotions. But yeah, there are people.
In the meantime, there are a couple of more questions, and I think they will be the last ones. So, Julia, and then Rosemary. Hello. We cannot hear you.
Thank you. So nice to see you, girls, and such a pleasure to listen to Christina's talk. It was amazing, and I enjoyed it very much. And I just wanted to make a small comment on one part when you were talking about psychoanalysis and metaphors and this kind of setting. And I just remember that well, personal story. My dentist once said, "Oh, I see this that you are grinding your teeth," because she saw that my teeth were kind of disappearing, right? And then yes, something is eating you. That's what she said, right? And something actually is not something, but it's me, right? Me eating myself. But this pain or whatever it was, right? It just metaphorizes in the teeth eating my body, basically. So that's I just wanted to share that. Then I thought, oh my God, this is so amazing that it's not the fear, it's not somebody, it's just me, myself, eating myself. But this is because of some kind of um, um, feelings or scares or whatever, right? So it's like, yeah, it's just like it is in our bodies. Like when you said there's pain in your back, right? This is actually us putting this pain there, and it's not something from the outside, really. So it is, yeah, it's in our mind. So yeah, so it's
Good
it's very
example of this play between literalness and very conventional idiom, like something hitting you from the inside, which usually refers to psychological reality. But here we have this concrete reality, which is kind of connected to psychological reality. So it's a bit complex case, but good job for dentist. She really has a sense of humor and a linguistic
Exactly.
talent, I would say.
Yeah, such an unusual situation to realize this, but still, it was quite interesting. For me, it was wow. Okay, well, thank you. I don't want to take up more time because I see there are more questions coming, but it was really pleasure and was delighted to listen to this talk and to be there. Thank you, Mariana, for letting us participate as well.
So good to see you too.
Bye.
Rose.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have maybe a question, like a follow-up question to Elena's question, and that is, or maybe a suggestion, I don't know. But I was wondering whether it would make sense for the suspension of the mapping to distinguish between the speaker and, or yeah, the metaphor producer and the recipient, because I can imagine also cases. So sometimes both pretend to suspend the mapping, but sometimes it might be the speaker having a metaphor in mind, first giving all the, I don't know, information about source domain and like a little story, and only then showing that it was actually meant metaphorically. And so the mapping is really suspended for the hearer, but not for the speaker themselves. So would that make sense? And would it also be possible to say, for instance, for therapy, that sometimes it really the client has to try to suspend, or really does suspend the mapping, but the therapists themselves, they never do that, for instance. And would that work?
Yes, thank you very much. Very good remark. I didn't have time here to go into all details, but of course, it definitely matters here who speaks and who believes what. It's a really complex relationship, like in the example with the dog. The interlocutor pretends to believe, and the target of the insult doesn't want to believe, but somehow is forced into the script. So even though you don't want to, you feel like you are put down and you're humiliated, so you're forced into the script. So, and in the examples where everybody believes the metaphor, those are special cases. And then with the therapy sessions as well. So, and with the theatric plays, again, completely another case with who believes what and who pretends to believe what. So yeah, kind of that it definitely plays a major role, like the dynamics between the speakers. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. And there is a last comment in the chat from Laura Narisano, and then it's taken again from Alice Giuliani. And the comment is, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how literalization interacts with metaphor creativity. Do more creative mappings facilitate literalization because they activate the source domain in a more noticeable manner? And then Alice says, I was wondering about the same topic of Laura. I think that metaphor literalization can be a different approach to afford creativity of metaphors. Black once said that active and strong metaphors, creative maybe, used to consider something as it is something else and not as if it is something else.
Yes, this is definitely very important thing, but then you cannot like equalize them because metaphorical creativity is another phenomenon. And even from my example, you have seen that you can be really creative with metaphor literalization strategy, or you can be also very conventional, like in the cases of good boy, attaboy, etc. But also you can have this example like fucktarded laptop and singing cards from grandparents. So as with any other metaphor use strategy here, you can be either creative or not creative. It's not like, but somehow I agree with you that this strategy makes you, I mean, it affords creativity, let's say maybe more than some other usage of metaphors, because even with this, when you enact, when you put your whole body into it, when you pretend you believe it, it definitely usually is more creative, more effective as well. Unfortunately, even in the sense of violence and insult, etc., etc. But yes, I think it does afford creativity in the sense of affordances, but it doesn't necessarily means that using a metaphor literalization strategy means that you are very creative. No, it doesn't have to be the same, but yes, it affords it. And it's definitely used a lot in advertising, in visual metaphors,
and also in dance practices. Vicky Fisher here says, I think this is something that is employed in some dance practices, although dance often shifts between strategies with moments that hint at literalization.
Yes, absolutely. I think that in art, it's probably very, very present. And I need to have more examples and look at more different products and realizations of this strategy. But yes, absolutely, in art, in personifications, in theater, in visual arts, absolutely. I think it's really, really
okay.
present
And used. Yes. All right. Well, thank you again very much for the very active and interactive participation. That was a very rich seminar. Thank you, Gudrun, and all everybody for co-hosting, co-organizing, and helping out and participating actively. Rosemary, you want to say
so much
again?
from my
No,
side as
she
well.
wants to clap. Okay.
It's so nice to see the Metaphor Lab people and my dear friends as well in the audience. So, and you here, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you again.
And happy holidays. Bye.
Happy
Have a nice
holidays.
day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.